G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So in this session of Jeremiah, we're in session 6. We're looking at chapter 7, verse 1 to chapter 8, verse 3. We'll just head off into it. We saw that, Jeremiah was a trial and a test for the people in the last session. And he's also going to be a fortress. Why? Because we know that most prophets are not very well liked by their people, and so he will need to be a fortress standing against their attacks. Now, just a quick review. We're in the second and largest segment of Jeremiah. It covers from chapter 2 to chapter 45, pretty big segment, and he deals in this section with prophecies concerning Judah. The first subdivision is chapter 2 to chapter 25, in which are messages of judgment against Judah and Jerusalem. There's going to be a series of 8 separate messages against Judah and Jerusalem. First message we had back in chapter 2 to chapter 6, that we've completed that now. The second message is this section that we're in, which is chapters 7 to 10, where Jeremiah is going to deal with false religions and their punishment. So we see the denunciation of the false use of the temple in chapter 7, verse 1 to chapter 8, verse 3, which is what we're going to cover today. Now, there are 5 main areas to examine in this section. We're going to look at the temple sermon in the first 15 verses, then the worship of the Queen of Heaven, obedience versus sacrifice in verse 21 to 28, the sin and judgment of Topheth, 29 to 34, and then we see the punishment for astral worship in chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. In this here, we look at the denunciation of the false use of the temple. Now, we see the temple sermon here in verses 1 to 15, and here, first up, we look at the admonition against a vain or an empty trust in the temple. This is in verses 1 to 7. This is an admission here against vain and empty trust in the existence of the temple as providing national security. Verse 1 and 2. The word that came to Jeremiah from Jehovah, saying, stand in the gate of Jehovah's house and proclaim there this word, and say, hear the word of Jehovah, all you of Judah, that enter in at these gates to worship Jehovah. So here in these first 2 verses, Jeremiah receives a message from God that he is to deliver to the people in a sermon. It's basically what it is. He was told to go and stand at the gate to Jehovah's house, that's the temple. And if we compare this with what we see in chapter 26, verse 10, it was probably one of the 3 inner gates of the inner wall. So this way, he would be facing into the outer court where the people would be beginning to congregate. Now, if he had this proclaimed at one of the 3 major festivals, either Passover, Pentecost, or Tabernacles, or a Feast of Weeks or Tabernacles, the audience would be that much greater, because in those occasions, there was a massive influx or a massive migration to the temple for the observance of these 3 festivals, and these are the 3 major festivals. We see in the second part of verse 2, we see a call to the worshippers that enter the gate. Hear the word of Jehovah, all ye of Judah that enter in at these gates to worship Jehovah. So the message he's now to proclaim, we find in verses 3 to 7. And starting off in verse 3, we have a call to repentance. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and I will cause you to dwell in this place. So he is in particular to address those who are entering in the gates for the worship of the God of Israel. And the worship they were performing, remember, was merely external conformity to the demands of the Mosaic law, which we've seen in previous chapters. They have, by this time, have developed a superstition concerning the temple. The assumption that they made here was that they had guaranteed security in the land, or at least in Jerusalem. Why? Because the temple is here. So they figured if the temple is here, we're safe here. They believed that their manner of lifestyle was totally irrelevant. Didn't matter how we lived, just so long as we were here at the temple, we'd be okay. But the message in verse 3 is that they should amend their ways and their doings. In other words, their lifestyle needs to change. And only by this manner will their dwelling in the land be guaranteed. If they want to continue living in the land, they need to change their lifestyle and change it pretty quickly. And in verse 4, they must stop saying, the temple of Jehovah, the temple of Jehovah, the temple of Jehovah are these. The people of Judah were trusting in deceptive words because these were lying words, and they had developed this superstition about the temple. Now, where did it come from? About 100 years earlier, in the days of Isaiah the prophet, the Assyrians were a major power. They were the ones who took the northern kingdom away. In the time of Hezekiah, one of the Assyrian monarchs, a man called Sennacherib, invaded the land. And the description of the invasion of the Assyrians under Sennacherib is given in detail in scripture in 3 different places. You can find it in 2 Kings 18:13 to 19:37. 2 Chronicles 32:1-23, and Isaiah chapters 36 and 37. Now, the thing that brought about the Sennacherib invasion was that King Hezekiah, rebelled against the Assyrians, and Hezekiah's actions went against what Isaiah's advice was. Isaiah said, just calm yourself down, just live underneath the rule of Sennacherib. Now, the Assyrians, they invaded, and one by one, the fortified cities of Judah collapsed. The Assyrians began approaching Jerusalem itself. And at that crucial point, Hezekiah, the king, he repented of his act of disobedience. He entered the temple compound and he prayed before the Lord. Now, because he repented, God intervened, and in one night, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers were killed by the angel of Jehovah. Now, this caused the Assyrians to withdraw from the city. They never achieved their goal of taking Jerusalem. And so, because of that one event and the miraculous protection and escape of Jerusalem, the superstition now developed. The superstition said that because of the existence of the temple in Jerusalem, the city became indestructible. While other cities in Judah can collapse, Jerusalem cannot collapse. It became a saying amongst them, the temple of Jehovah, the temple of Jehovah. That was all that was needed to encourage others concerning any threat from the outside to Jerusalem. The point of Jeremiah's message is that the existence of the temple in Jerusalem by itself did not provide any protection whatsoever. True security is found in verses 5-7. Now, in verses 5-6, they must obey the law of Moses. Verse 5 says, "For if you thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if you thoroughly execute justice between a man and his neighbor, if you oppress not the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, and shed not innocent blood in this place, neither walk after gods to your own hurt." Now, the two major themes of the Mosaic law are love for one's neighbor and love for God. And this is exactly what we're seeing here. And here, Jeremiah lists a series of things, most of which fall under the general heading in the Mosaic law of loving your neighbor. They must amend their ways and their doings. They must execute justice between men. They mustn't oppress the orphan, the widow, or the sojourner. They must not shed innocent blood. Obviously, they were doing these things. Also, it says they should not worship other gods. And this deals with the other aspect of the law, which is loving God, which is shown by staying faithful to him rather than walking after other gods to one's own destruction and ruin. So Jeremiah is saying to them, change your ways. And if you do these things and obey the Mosaic law, only in this manner can they receive guaranteed assurance that they'll be able to live in the land. That's all they had to do. Jeremiah goes on to write in verse 7, God says, "Then will I cause you to dwell in this place, in the land that I gave to your fathers from of old, even forevermore. So, guaranteed assurance of living in security and safety in Jerusalem and in the land only comes by means of obedience and not by the existence of a building inside the city, not by the existence of the temple. And that was, remember, that was what the Mosaic law said. If you do these things, I will bless you. If you don't do these things, I'm going to curse you and bring persecution, which is exactly what happened. Now, we see Israel's sin here in regard to the temple in verses 8 to 11. Behold, you trust in lying words that cannot profit. Will you steal, murder, and commit adultery, and swear falsely, and burn incense unto Baal, and walk after other gods that you have not known? And come and stand before me in this house which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered, that you may do all these abominations? Is this house which is called by my name become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, even I have seen it, saith Jehovah. So in these verses, verses 8 to 11, he spells out Israel's or Judah's sin against the temple. And in verse 8, behold, you trust in lying words that cannot profit. So this repeats the admonition of verse 4, which we just did. What these lying words involved is now spelled out in verses 9 to 10. In verse 9, we have a consistent disobedience to or in violation of law of Moses. When it says you shall not steal, what were they doing? They stole. When it says you shall not murder, what were they doing? They were murdering. When it says you shall not commit adultery, they commit adultery. When it says you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, they swear falsely. When it says you shall have no other gods before me, they burn incense unto Baal, and they walk after other gods which they have not known. This is word for word from Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 28. Deuteronomy 11, verse 28. When they come to the temple to worship, what they've done is they have made Jehovah one among several other gods. He's simply just one of the options that they have. They come to the temple because they enjoy the festivities, probably those three main festivals. And remember, these are all involved. This is being involved in the Mosaic system of worship here. So they come for the festivities, but the inner obedience that was required for the observance of those feasts or festivals had been totally forgotten. Why? Because we see by their actions, there was no inward obedience. There's no inner obedience at all. In fact, it was totally rebellious. So while they're in active disobedience to the Mosaic law, in verse 10, the hypocrisy of the people comes out. They come, verse 10 says, they come and they stand before me in this house, in the temple, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered, that you may do all these abominations. So what's he saying? Well, while in active disobedience, while in active rebellion against the Mosaic law, against God, they came to Jehovah's house and claimed automatic forgiveness of all the sins of verse 9 because they simply appeared before God in the temple. Just turning up was good enough. We have nothing to fear. We've offered our sacrifices, and therefore God will deliver us. That's what they believed. That's what they thought. That's what they practiced. Now, this behavior is a good example of confession without repentance. It's not enough to confess one's sins. There has to be an inner repentance. There has to be an inner change of mind. I'm going to stop doing that, but I've just confessed I have been doing. And the result of that would be or should be a turning away from those sins. But guess what? None of this was the case at the time of Judah. I just kept on doing it. In verse 11, is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, even I have seen it, says Jehovah. So the tragic result in verse 11 is that the temple has become a den of robbers. It's become a den of thieves. And this was a den of robbers, even in the eyes of the worshippers. They recognized it. And this is the verse that Jesus quotes in the New Testament in Matthew 21, verse 13. Matthew 21, 13. Jesus says, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." Also, that's repeated in the synoptics in Mark 11, verse 17, Mark 11, 17, and Luke 19:46. Luke 19:46. You see, the temple was viewed by them as nothing more than a good luck charm. I just got to turn up there and it's just going to bless me somehow. The temple was the place where thieves go to hide after they've committed their crimes. That's what was happening. Instead of being made holy in the temple, what they were doing was the people were making the temple unholy by their very presence there. So even though they had sinned many times, no matter how many times they sinned, they believed they'd be safe as long as the temple was standing. It doesn't matter what I'm doing or what my life is like, so long as that temple is there, we'll be safe. And the verse ends, "Behold, even I have seen it, says the Lord." So God emphatically declared that he saw it all, their hypocrisy and superstition and disobedience. He didn't miss a thing. And God's answer to their self-security is about to be given. He's going to give him a lesson about a place called Shiloh. This we find in verses 12 to 15 of chapter 7. In verse 12, we have an admonition to learn the lesson of Shiloh. And this lesson is to be repeated in chapter 26, verse 6. Verse 12 says, "But go you now unto my place, which was in Shiloh, where I caused my name to dwell at the first, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel." Now, according to Jeremiah 41, verse 5, which we'll come to in many weeks' time, there were still people living in Shiloh. However, Shiloh was no longer a key center. It had become a very insignificant, minor, rundown village. That's all it was. Yet, Shiloh was the first place where God had put his name. This was when they came into the land. This was the first place where the tabernacle was erected after the Jews had crossed over the Jordan River into the promised land. And this is brought out by Joshua 18, verse 1, and 1 Samuel 1, verse 3. Now, at one time, it was Shiloh where the center of the worship of God was located. It was not at Jerusalem. The Holy of Holies and the Shekinah glory were located at Shiloh. Now, the existence of the tabernacle in Shiloh did not protect it, because God says, "And see what I did to it." Now, archaeologically, we know that Shiloh was destroyed around 1050 BC. And if we compare that with 1 Samuel 4, 1 to 22, 1 Samuel 4, 1 to 22, after the Philistines defeated Israel and captured the Ark of the Covenant in battle, they continued on and they destroyed Shiloh. So the existence of the tabernacle did not protect Shiloh. Another passage similar to this is Psalm 78, verse 60. Psalm 78, verse 60. So why was Shiloh destroyed? Shiloh was destroyed because of the wickedness of my people Israel. So even the very act of taking the Ark of the Covenant out of the Holy of Holies and taking it into battle was an act of disobedience, but they did it anyway. The Jews of Samuel's day made the same mistake as the Jews of Jeremiah's day. They began viewing the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant as a good luck charm. After all, remember, when they first came into the land, when the Ark was carried around Jericho, the walls fell. So they believed that if the Ark was taken into battle, the Philistines would also fall. They began to misinterpret the meaning of the Ark. What happened was it became a good luck charm to them. The same thing happened in Jeremiah's day. This misconstrued the meaning of the temple. it became nothing more than a good luck charm to them. What happened to Shiloh could also happen to Jerusalem for the very same reasons of wickedness and disobedience. Now, it is true that God could protect his holy temple if he desired, but his temple in Jerusalem was no longer holy. It was a den of thieves. Better there was no temple at all than that hypocrisy should desecrate God's house. In verse 13, he deals with their present sin. Because you have done all these works, so these works are the sins which we just looked at in verses 9 to 10. Not only did they disobey the Mosaic law and disobey the works, they also rejected the prophets. And I spoke to you rising up early and speaking. So the phrase Jeremiah uses here, rising up early and speaking, is Jeremiah's own idiom for the prophetic voice. And he uses it several times throughout this book, rising up early and speaking. But you heard not, and I called you, but you answered not. So as they rejected the law, so they also rejected the message of the prophets. God spoke, but they didn't hear. God called, but they didn't answer. Now, we see the result in the threat in verses 14 to 15. God now threatens Jerusalem. Concerning the temple in verse 14, therefore will I do unto the house which is called by my name, wherein you trust, and unto the place which I gave to you and to your fathers, as I did to Shiloh. So what he's saying here is what God did to Shiloh, he's also going to do to the temple. The very thing in which they are trusting is going to be destroyed. The temple is a false security for them. Now, concerning the people in verse 15, and I will cast you out of my sight, as I have cast out all your brethren, even the whole seed of Ephraim. Remember, Ephraim stood for the northern kingdom. So just as the northern kingdom went into captivity to Assyria, so the southern kingdom will also go into captivity. What happened to Israel in the north will also happen to Judah in the south. Now in verses 16 to 20, we have the worship of the Queen of Heaven. This is another key problem. Besides hypocritically viewing the temple as a good luck charm, in these verses 16 to 20, there is also the problem of the worship of the Queen of Heaven. Now, God addresses Jeremiah directly in verse 16. Therefore, pray not you for this people, neither lift up cry nor prayer for them, neither make intercession to me, for I will not hear you. Why? Because their incurable sickness has reached the point where they are beyond help. No matter how much Jeremiah intercedes for them, God will not hear. 3 different times, Jeremiah was told not to pray for the Jewish nation. And we see these here in Jeremiah 7, verse 16. Also, Jeremiah 11, verse 14, 11, verse 14, and 14, verse 11. So it's 11, 14, 14, 11 are the other 2 times where he's commanded not to pray for them. However, Jeremiah, on 2 occasions, he actually disobeyed God. First, we're going to see it in Jeremiah 14, verses 19 to 22, where he will pray for the people. And again, we're going to see it in Jeremiah 18, verse 20, where again, he'll pray for the people. Now, in this context here, he was told not to pray for the people, and the reason is in verses 17 to 19. They are guilty of praying and worshiping the Queen of Heaven. In verse 17, see you not what they do in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem? Jeremiah was supposed to take a close look at the people's behavior. It shows again that Josiah's reformation was external. Remember, Josiah was the last good king. His reformation was external. It reached the idolatry centers and the places where there are human sacrifices, but the Reformation did not reach the mother's kitchens, which we see in 2 Kings 23, 1 to 26. In verse 18, describes a system of worship here. It involves the entire family. The children gather wood and the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead the dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven. So, not content with just regarding the temple as a good luck charm, the people of Judah had made matters worse by actively worshipping a false god, the Queen of Heaven. The children went out and gathered wood, the fathers kindled the fire, and as we're going to see later on in Jeremiah, it was primarily the women who led in this worship. The women were the ones who made the special cakes, and these special cakes are also mentioned in Jeremiah 44 verse 19. Jeremiah 44 verse 19. They were baked in the form of images to this goddess. It was then laid upon the queen's altar by the mother in the home, and then the entire family congregated together to worship the Queen of Heaven. This Queen of Heaven went by several names depending upon where you were located. Her Semitic names were Astarte or Ashtart, Astarte. The Babylonian Assyrian name was Ishtar. And then we had the Greeks and the Romans called her Venus. So in the Babylonian and the Canaanite worship, temple prostitution was involved. And some of this is hinted at in Genesis 38, verse 21, and Deuteronomy 23, verse 18. Also, in certain periods of time, the worship not only included temple prostitution, but also homosexuality. And this is mentioned in 1 Kings 14:24 and 1 Kings 15:12 and 1 Kings 22, verse 46. Now, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, in somewhere around 484 to 425 BC, in Babylon, under the name of Ishtar, all women before marriage had to prostitute themselves to strangers at the sanctuary of Ishtar before the wedding day. How gross. And all of this was involved in the worship of the Queen of Heaven. In addition to that, Jeremiah also said that they poured out drink offerings to other gods. So that, again, the Queen of Heaven was one among many gods who was worshipped. Remember, we saw before that Jehovah was one of their options of gods to worship. Other gods were also mentioned in Jeremiah 19, verse 13 and chapter 32, verse 29. One of Jeremiah's contemporaries also mentions this in Zephaniah 1:5. Now, Zephaniah 1:5. Now, the reason they worshipped the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings to other gods was to provoke me to anger. That's to provoke Jehovah to anger. A total of 10 times, Jeremiah will say in his book that they do these things to provoke God to anger. And we see that in chapter 7, verse 19 here, which we're going to see shortly, chapter 8, verse 19, chapter 11, verse 17, 25, verse 6 and 7, 32, verse 29, and 30 and 32, and then chapter 44, verse 3 and 8. Now, this is the first time here that Jeremiah makes this point. Now, their sin calls for the anger of God and invokes his wrath. And the picture here is that Judah will sometimes deliberately go out of their way to vex God, to anger God. And elsewhere, Jeremiah will bring out that this is their purpose. Now, sometimes they'll have no other reason for this type of worship except that they know this is the way they can repudiate the religion of their fathers. But that is exactly what they wanted to do. And by doing that, they were deliberately provoking God to anger. So they're going to actively do it for that reason. Verse 19 shows that this provocation of God's anger would backfire. Do they provoke me to anger, says Jehovah? Do they not provoke themselves to the confusion of their own faces? The point here is that what they're doing to actually anger God will actually result in themselves being vexed because of the punishment It's going to come from God because of their actions. And then in verse 20, the final result will be the wrath of God. Therefore, thus says the Lord Jehovah, behold, my anger and my wrath shall be poured out upon this place, upon man and upon beast and upon the trees of the field and upon the fruit of the ground, and it shall burn and shall not be quenched. So it will burn against the entire land. It will devour man, the beast, and vegetation, and it will continue burning without quenching. Now in verses 21 to 28, we're going to see that obedience has priority over sacrifice. So after he's been speaking with Jeremiah in the previous verses, we now come back to the prophet's temple sermon, and this emphasizes the real point of this sermon, that is that obedience has priority over sacrifice. In verse 21, multiplying sacrifices to alleviate their problem will be of no use. It says here, thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, add your burnt offerings onto your sacrifices and eat you flesh. So normally burnt offerings were wholly burned on the altar, but God had little, well, he had so little, or he had no interest in the sacrifices of apostasy Judah. The people might as well eat the sacrifices themselves. So what he's saying is increasing your burnt offerings and not going to revert judgment. It's still coming. Now, having said this is a starting point, the rest of this section now deals with a lesson from history. In verses 22 to 23, the command God gave their fathers was not that sacrifice had priority, but that obedience had priority. Verse 22, for I spoke not unto your fathers, nor commanded them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices. I didn't speak to them about that. But this thing I commanded them, saying, hearken unto my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk you in all the way that I command you, that it may be well with you. So an implied question in these verses, what was the command that God had given to the fathers? Was it to do with sacrifices and burnt offerings? No, it wasn't. The answer is obedience takes priority. Obedience takes priority over sacrifice. Now, the results of obedience would have been that God would be their God and they would be his people. If Israel worshiped God and him alone, they would show their love for him by obedience to him. Remember, Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Obedience to God included the sacrificial system. The sacrifices did not have priority over obedience. The purpose of obedience was that it might be well with them, that life might be good for them. The sacrifices were intended as part of a lifestyle for those who were true worshippers of God. Those who lived a life of obedience to him would sacrifice. However, they felt that they could sin more and more so that grace would abound. They believed that they could sacrifice as much as they sinned. So if I do all these sins, I just do all these sacrifices. They believe it didn't really matter how much they sinned because they could simply offer more sacrifices. They made sacrifices and placed sacrifices in priority over obedience. The sacrifices were offered with the wrong heart motive. There was no internal change. It was all external. It's important to keep in mind here that the passage does not constitute a rejection of the Mosaic sacrificial system as such. Jeremiah was not negating this sacrificial system, but teaching that sacrifices were secondary to obedience to God. This was not new with this present generation, because in verse 24, their own fathers disobeyed along these lines. But they did not obey or incline their ear, but walked in their own counsels in the stubbornness of their evil hearts, and went backward and not forward. So their fathers disobeyed and walked in the stubbornness of their own evil hearts. They went backwards, not forward in their spiritual lives. They regressed. In verses 25 to 26, the same point is made as was made earlier. From the day that your fathers came out of the land of Egypt to this day, I have persistently sent all my servants, the prophets, to them day after day. They not only received the Mosaic law, but they also rejected the prophets. The prophets were sent to Israel from the early days of their history after the Exodus. Nevertheless, in verse 26, the prophets were rejected. Yet they did not listen to me or incline their ear, but stiffened their neck. They did worse than their fathers. There was active disobedience. Their disobedience was worse than the disobedience of their fathers in earlier generations. Now in verses 27 to 28, God gives a warning to Jeremiah. So you shall speak all these words to them, but they'll not listen to you. You shall call to them, but they'll not answer you. So the present generation will not listen to Jeremiah any more than previous generations listened to previous prophets. And you shall say to them, verse 28, this is a nation that did not obey the voice of the Lord their God and did not accept discipline. Truth has perished. It is cut off from their lips. Now, he is to make the declaration in verse 28 concerning the nation. They did not obey the voice of their Lord. They did not receive discipline. They did not learn the lessons of previous discipline. So truth is now perished and cut off from the land. The Hebrew word for nation that we see here, this nation, in verse 28 is the word goy, G-O-Y. It's a term that normally is used for Gentiles. So why he's using it here is because Judah was acting as a pagan nation and not a Jewish nation. And truth, the word truth is better translated as faith. So they practiced external acts of the sacrificial faith, but there was no internal faith. So sacrifices apart from faith are absolutely useless. 29 to 34, we see the sin and the judgment of Topheth. In this verses now, he elaborates upon Topheth's sin. We're going to see a lot more of this in chapter 19. 29 says, cut off thy hair, O Jerusalem, and cast it away. Take up a lamentation on the bare heights. For Jehovah hath rejected and forsaken the generation of his wrath. So in verse 29, he begins with the exhortation to mourning. The signs of mourning are, first of all, they should cut off your hair and cast it away. Now, sounds strange, doesn't it? But the root word for cut is the root word for Nazarite. In Numbers chapter 6, verse 1 to 21, a person could take the vow of a Nazarite. And one of the ways he showed that he was under the vow was by not having his hair cut. He would allow his hair to grow. Now, when the vow was completed, the hair would then be cut off and offered upon the altar. However, if during his vow a Nazarite was defiled by touching a dead body or by some other means, then he was to cut off his hair and cast it away. His defiled hair was no longer a right sacrifice to be placed upon the altar because it had been defiled. So the picture that we're seeing here is that Zion or Jerusalem has become like a defiled Nazarite. It was to be cut off. It was no longer qualifying as an offering to God. Jerusalem was no longer the virgin consecrated to God. The second sign of mourning, they were to take up a lamentation upon the bare heights. Now, earlier on in Jeremiah, back in chapter 2, verse 20, and chapter 3, verses 2 and 21, Jeremiah 2:20 and Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 2 and 21, we were told the bare heights were the centers of idolatrous worship. The bare heights were the tops of mountains which had no trees. And what they're to do here is they were to lament at the very centers of their idolatrous worship centers. And the reason for the mourning was that Jehovah had forsaken and rejected the generation of his wrath. God had rejected and abandoned this generation, which was now under his judgment, his wrath. In 30 to 31, there are three reasons for the rejection. First, For the children of Judah have done that which is evil in my sight, says Jehovah. They have done evil in the sight of Jehovah. Second, they have set their abominations in the house which is called by my name to defile it. So what they've done is they've set up these abominable idols in the temple compound. And we're going to see, if you want, there's more details of that in 2 Kings chapter 16, verses 10 to 18, and 2 Kings 21, verses 4 to 9. And the third thing is they have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded not, neither came it into my mind. So that means they have offered human sacrifice in Topheth. Now, no one is absolutely certain where the root word for Tophet comes from, but the best guess is that it probably refers to an Aramaic word which means an oven or a fireplace. Now, in the Hebrew, the vowel pointing for Topheth is the same as the Hebrew word boshet, B-O-S-H-E-T, and sounds very similar, which was a slang term for the worship of Baal. So it means the shame or the shameful thing. So the place of Topheth was in one of the two valleys which circled Jerusalem. It was the valley of Hinnom. The Hebrew name of this valley is Gai Hinnom, which became Gina in Greek, and Gina in turn became the root of the English word Gehenna. And that what this all means is it's signifying the eternal abode of the unsaved, which is the lake of fire. The concept, this is where the concept originates here as far as its name. Now, the worship of Topheth involved human sacrifice, because we see that the purpose of Tophet was to burn their sons and daughters in the fire. So here the sacrifices were made to a particular god named Moloch. Human sacrifice was practiced by some of the wicked kings in Jewish history at this point. If you look back in history, 2 Kings 23 verse 10, 2 Chronicles 28 verse 3, and 2 Chronicles 33 verse 6. Also, when we get to Jeremiah 19:5, and also Jeremiah 32 verse 35. And the other prophet is Ezekiel, which we find in Ezekiel 16 verses 20 to 21. Now, this place, Gehinnom or Tophet, was the place of burning of humans. This was in violation of God's command from Leviticus 18:21. Now, ultimately, the lake of fire is the same thing. The lake of fire is the eternal burning of humans. The word Gehinnom went to Gehenna as a term for the lake of fire. Now, as early as Isaiah chapter 30, verse 33, it was already a slang term for the burning of humans as a basis for more eternal punishment later. Now, what is happening to the physical part of man in Topheth will ultimately happen to the whole man in the lake of fire, to the unbeliever. Isaiah 30 verse 33 says, "For a Topheth is prepared of old, yes, for the king it is made ready. He has made it deep and large. The pile thereof is fire and much wood. The breath of Jehovah, like a stream of brimstone, does kindle it." So that's Isaiah 30 verse 33. Now, this entire practice was in clear violation, he says, to God's command, which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind. So again, it's clearly forbidden in Leviticus 18. It was one of the things that they actively did to provoke the anger of the Lord. The judgment of Topheth, we see in verse 32, it shows that the valley of Hinnom would receive a new name that reflects the atrocities committed there. Verse 32, "Therefore, behold, the days come, says Jehovah, that it shall no more be called Topheth, nor the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. For they shall bury in Topheth till there be no place to bury." So, going to get a new name. It's going to become known as the Valley of Slaughter. Why? Because there'll be such a large amount of slaughter that they'll bury and bury until there's no longer any room to bury any further. And then in verse 33, and the dead bodies of this people shall be food for the bird of the heavens and for the beast of the earth, and none shall frighten them away. So the unburied bodies will remain in the open for the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And the effect upon the cities of Judah in verse 34. Then will I cause to cease from the cities of Judah and from the streets of Jerusalem the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, for the land shall become a waste. There will no longer be the voice of mirth and gladness, no longer the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. The land itself shall become a desolation. Now, we're going to look at the sin of Topheth a lot more in detail in chapter 19. However, the full effects of Topheth did not take place in 586 BC when Babylon destroyed the place, but in AD 70 when Rome destroyed the city and the temple. That's when it took place. Now we have in chapter 8:1-3, we have another act of apostasy here that became very common before the Babylonian captivity, and this was the worship of astral deities. Now, according to 2 Kings 21 verse 3 and 2 Kings 23:4, 2 Kings 21:3, 2 Kings 23:4, this practice was especially customary in the days of Manasseh. However, as Ezekiel 8:16 points out, even before and after Manasseh, the people of Israel worshiped the signs of the heavens. Verse 1. At that time, saith Jehovah, they shall bring out the bones of the kings of Judah and the bones of his princes, the bones of the priests and the bones of the prophets, and the bones of the inhabitants of Jerusalem out of their graves. So in verse 1, the time is coming when the bones shall be removed. And he mentions 5 categories of people here. He uses what is called a pentad. It comes in 5s. First of all, the kings of Judah, the princes, the prophets, the priests, and the inhabitants. And in verse 2, and they shall spread them before the sun and the moon and all the hosts of heaven, which they have loved, and which they have served, and after which they have walked, and which they have sought, and which they have worshipped. They shall not be gathered, nor be buried. They shall be for dung upon the face of the earth. So the bones will be exposed to the very signs of the heavens which they had worshipped. The second pentad, the second thing of 5 things here is, which they're guilty of in relationship to these worshipping the host of heaven, is that they loved it, they served it, they walked in it, they thought of it, and they worshipped it. The text is very emphatic here concerning what they're guilty of. They are guilty of astrology and occultism to the hilt. These bones that are taken out of the tombs will be exposed. They'll not be gathered or buried. They'll simply lie there like dung on the ground. In verse 3, chapter 8, and death shall be chosen rather than life by all the residue that remain of this evil family, that remain in all the places whither I have driven them, says Jehovah of hosts. So the devastation, the suffering will be so terrible that some will choose death as the final product, and those who survive the judgment would consider death better than remaining alive. And this is where we end it for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.